But does anyone else here avoid conflict like the plague? Because I don't necessarily mean like fighting somebody or screaming at somebody, but just maybe avoiding a tough conversation or apologizing after a tough conversation might have gone bad. I'm the worst when it comes to conflict. But what I'm the best at is avoiding it. I don't like to talk about my feelings. I don't like to recognize that I might have hurt somebody else's feelings. I don't like to admit that I was wrong. I don't like to go into really any of that. I don't like asking for help. If I was born probably 20 years earlier, I'd be that guy driving around for hours just because I won't ask for directions and my wife's just yelling at me. And if you're that guy, we do have Google Maps, so get it together. And it's not a pride thing for me. I know that's probably where a lot of our head goes, especially those of us with stubborn dads, is the guy that doesn't ask for directions. It's a pride thing. But for me, it's going to sound a little bit more dramatic than being too proud, but it's because I imagine just worst case scenario in any interaction that I have. So my mind just jumps to, what if I ask that guy for directions and he just yells at me for interrupting his day or makes fun of me? That's even worse, for not being able to figure things out like a man should or whatever. But that's really where my mind goes before any interaction I have. It's just worst case scenario. And eventually, I'll ask for those directions because I don't think it's my pride, but and 100% of the time so far, when I ask for directions, it's ended just fine. They've never made fun of me. But there might be that one time, and I just never know. And just think, that's kind of a situation with a stranger that I've never met, and a quick, easy question. Now, I'm going to talk about when it comes to that same situation with somebody that I love and I care about, because it doesn't change from stranger to somebody that I care about. And just to kind of preface this story, I've been working on this for a really long time. I still kind of struggle with these things, but not nearly as bad as I used to when I was a teenager. And that's where the story kind of takes place. Was in high school, I was kind of a screw up. Just making a lot of bad decisions and lying about them. And not bad decisions, like I wasn't doing drugs or drinking constantly. It wasn't really that. It was just not doing what I was supposed to be doing and then lying about it when I was confronted. And a little bit of backstory here, which might make me sound like an even worse person. But my mom was having her second double lung transplant in 2 years when I was in high school. And if you don't know how transplants work, you pretty much get put on a list, you get a call. Once you get that call, you have to go get the transplant done right then. They have the lungs, you need to be ready for them. And the only team of doctors that would do it for my mom for her second one was a team in Arizona. So one day, her and my dad got the call, and that day, they had to get their go bags and fly to Arizona for the surgery. And it wasn't just surgery. It was 6 more months of them observing my mom and her new lungs just to make sure that everything was working fine. So here I am, 18 years old, senior year of high school, left alone with no parental supervision. My plan is I'm going to buckle down and just go to school, get my grades up, make my parents proud while they deal with this emotional situation. No way am I going to add to their problems. I did nothing but add to their problems. I didn't do any of that. I stopped going to school. And when the school would call my parents, I would just make up some lie and just hopefully end the conversation as soon as possible. And I knew that it kind of started to wear on them because my lies would stop being challenged and they just stopped calling me about it. They had a lot more going on, but they would just bring it up less and less, and I just kept doing what I was doing. I was sleeping in every day. I was skipping class. I was throwing parties at my empty house. And reflecting back now, I do recognize this is a hard situation for an 18-year-old to be put in. I put a lot of blame on myself, but I still regret that time in my life and how I handled that. No matter if it is a hard thing for an 18-year-old to be going through. And really just simply put, I wasn't doing what I was supposed to be doing, and I was avoiding any kind of confrontation that brought that to light and showed how bad and selfish of a person I was being for living this way. And I damaged a lot of relationships during this time. My parents couldn't trust me, and I knew they were disappointed, but they had more on their plate. I'm pretty sure my oldest brother resented me for a really long time after this. We never had the closest relationship. He's 13 years older than I am, so he kind of had more of a parental status that he thought he had. But I think we hated each other for years, and I think a lot of it stemmed from my actions. And it really hasn't been since the last 3 or 4 years that I feel like we've finally started getting along and that animosity isn't there. We have our differences, but I don't think it really stems from that. Even my grandma and I would just get in screaming matches because she felt like I didn't care about my mom because I was making her life harder when she was already going through some pretty hard stuff. And fighting with your grandma, if you haven't, don't. It's not fun. It doesn't make you feel good. And it wasn't that I didn't care. I cared a lot. But I didn't want to confront any of the issues going on. And that's kind of just how my family works. It's not really just me. I didn't learn this by myself. It was something kind of passed down. Because I don't think to this day that any of us have really talked about what happened at that point in our lives. We just kind of ignore the feelings until they dissipate. That's just how we've always functioned. And it wasn't just the 6 months when I was 18 years old and she was gone. It continued. This pattern of not doing what I was supposed to be doing and lying about it continued for years and years and years. And like I said, I damaged a lot of relationships with the people closest to me. And I realize now that I didn't realize then that it wasn't just teenage rebellion. I was developing this habit, this pattern. And that pattern was avoid the truth, avoid confrontation, and avoid responsibility. And I can't imagine I'm alone in that. I'm sure there's people here with unfinished conversations, buried guilt, relationships that we're still hoping time is going to fix for us. You know, we tell ourselves, if I just avoid it long enough, it'll go away. And that's kind of where we start to see Jacob in chapter 33 of Genesis. So if you haven't opened there yet, I'll give you some time. I'm going to kind of recap what Jacob's been going through. He stole his inheritance from his brother Esau, and Esau pretty much pledged to kill him for doing that. And so Jacob fled. And for 20 years, Jacob's been building wealth, building a family, building a reputation. And then he kind of comes to God, and God tells him to return home to Bethel. And part of the issue with going home is confronting his brother Esau. And he's pretty sure Esau is going to kill him. So he had a wrestling match with God. We talked last week. Nate gave a message about that where God touches his hip and he blesses him because Jacob won't stop wrestling until God blesses him. So he does, but he kind of wounds him. And chapter 33 is taking place the next day. Jacob's kind of lost his control and is more dependent than he's ever been. And he just found out that Esau has pretty much an army of 400 men that are out there that he has to face. So chapter 33 goes into, and Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the 2 female servants. And he put the servants with their children in front, then Leah and her children, and Rachel and Joseph last of all. He himself went on before them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Probably not what he was expecting when he thought his brother was going to kill him. And then Esau lifted up his eyes and saw the women and children. He said, "Who are these with you?" Jacob said, the children whom God has graciously given your servant. Then the servants drew near, they and their children, and bowed down. Leah likewise and her children drew near and bowed down, and last Joseph and Rachel drew near, and they bowed down. So before Jacob wrestled with God, obviously he was afraid of Esau. He kind of had a pattern of not putting himself in harm's way. Jacob was never really this great role model. We saw Nate talk last week about he would send gifts ahead of him that got better and better just to hopefully calm Esau down when they finally met. And then he even split his family into two parts before they met Esau, so that in case Esau did attack them, they would attack one group while the other group could get away. And I'm sure we can imagine what group Jacob was in. It wasn't the first group. But he had spent his whole life kind of having somebody else go ahead of him. Gifts, family, servants, anything he could to avoid being the one who had to face the consequences. But here we see Jacob goes before them and bows down in front of Esau. So this is already immediately, after his wrestling match with God, immediately a different way that we see Jacob to how he usually handles conflict. You know, as far as he still knows, Esau is going to kill him. To this point, he doesn't know. But he's finally starting to trust God. This is that idea of God blessed him and made a promise, and he's starting to trust him. You know, this melody is what we've seen with Noah and the burnt offerings after the flood and Abraham ready to sacrifice Isaac. It's this trust in God that kind of pushes you through to do the difficult things. Yeah, and God's promise was that he would protect Jacob and his family. But then Jacob obviously gets like the opposite of what my worst case scenario mind would make up is Esau hugs, embraces, he kisses him, and is forgiving him. And then it goes on, verse 8, Esau said, "What do you mean by all this company that I met?" Jacob answered, "To find favor in the sight of my Lord." But Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." Jacob said, "No, please. If I have found favor in your sight, then accept my presents from my hand, for I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you have accepted me. Please accept my blessing that is brought to you, because God dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough." Thus he urged him, and he took it. So it's just kind of a back and forth. Jacob's trying to give gifts. Esau's like, "I don't need it either. Like, I'm good." Esau takes them, but this is also the first time we saw in the last chapter him sending these gifts to try to calm him down. This is the first time he's giving a gift genuinely and because of the abundance that God has graced him with. Then Esau said, "Let us journey on our way, and we will go ahead of you." But Jacob said to him, "My Lord knows that the children are frail, and that the nursing flocks and herds are a care to me. If they are driven hard for one day, all the flocks will die. Let my Lord pass on ahead of his servant, and I will lead on slowly at the pace of the livestock that are ahead of me, and at the pace of the children, until I come to my Lord in Seir." So Esau's on his way to Seir. That's not where Jacob's going. And this is where we kind of notice, just because we're starting to trust God doesn't mean that we magically change, that everything is better. Jacob's still being deceitful. What he's saying here is Esau's essentially inviting him now. He forgave him. He's like, "Come with us. Like, let's be together, come to Seir with us." And Jacob is lying to him. He's saying, "You know what? We're pretty tired. All the livestock are tired. If we push them for another day, they'll probably just all die. So you go on ahead. We'll catch up. Don't worry about it." So Esau said, "Let me leave you with some people who are with me." But he said, "What need is there? Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord." So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir, but Jacob journeyed to Succoth and built himself a house and made booths for his livestock. Therefore, the name of the place is called Succoth. And Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, on his way from Padan Aram. And he camped before the city, and from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he bought for 100 pieces of money the piece of land on which he had pitched his tent. There he erected an altar and called it El Elohe Israel. So Esau even offered to leave Jacob some of his people. Like, hey, we just want to make sure you guys are safe and good. Let me leave these people with you. He's like, no, we're good. We don't need any of your people. You go ahead. He's still lying to Esau. And so Esau eventually goes to Seir. Jacob decides to go to Succoth, and he buys some land there. And this is still Jacob not doing what Jacob is supposed to be doing. God's command for him was to return to Bethel. So we're to assume if he's buying land in this place that is not Bethel, he's going to stay there a while. So he's still kind of in this pattern. He's starting to trust God a little bit more, but not fully. And he's still not doing the things that he's supposed to be doing. But we do see kind of this reconciliation, right? This forgiveness between Esau and Jacob. And that's due to God's intervention and his promise to Jacob. Because we think of brothers kind of beefing in the Bible. I think our minds, right, go Cain and Abel. And that ended a lot differently than this one did. But it was starting to follow the same patterns because God had kind of favored Jacob over Esau just like he favored Abel over Cain. And this one ended a lot differently. Instead of death, we get forgiveness due to God's intervention and his grace over Jacob. And forgiveness doesn't always mean that we're going to live happily ever after. They didn't get together and go live in Seir together and have a family all together. Sometimes it does just mean moving on. Because we are humans and we're never going to do anything right. But even though Esau forgave Jacob, Jacob still lied to him before separating. And that deceit and conflict avoidance that Jacob has, and we've seen a pattern of this from him, is something that's still embedded in him and his family. It didn't magically go away. I mentioned earlier in my story that we've really never talked about that time in our lives, my family and I. And even though I feel like we've reconciled, like all those relationships don't feel as fractured as they were before, just like Jacob and Esau, but that doesn't mean that the pattern is broken. Sometimes when that pattern comes back, it becomes more destructive, and destructive patterns like that can pass down to our children. Like I said, I didn't just learn how to lie and be deceitful. That came from somewhere else. And we're going to kind of see this play out in chapter 34, which is a long-ish chapter, but I do want to read it in its entirety because I feel like it's an easy one to kind of get caught up in some things. So I'm going to kind of read it in its full, and then we're going to go back and kind of talk about what's going on. So chapter 34, verse 1. Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, who she had borne to Jacob, went out to see the women of the land. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, he seized her and lay with her and humiliated her. And his soul was drawn to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. He loved the young woman and spoke tenderly to her. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, "Get me this girl for my wife." Now Jacob heard that he had defiled his daughter Dinah, but his sons were with his livestock in the field, so Jacob held his peace until they came. And Hamor the father of Shechem went out to Jacob to speak with him. The sons of Jacob had come in from the field as soon as they heard of it, and the men were indignant and very angry, because he had done an outrageous thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, for such a thing must not be done. But Hamor spoke with him, saying, "The soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him to be his wife. Make marriages with us, give your daughters to us, and take our daughters for yourselves. You shall dwell with us, and the land shall be open to you. Dwell and trade in it, and get property in it." Shechem also said to her father and to her brothers, "Let me find favor in your eyes, and whatever you say to me I will give. Ask me for as great a bride price and gift as you will, and I will give whatever you say to me. Only give me the young woman to be my wife." The sons of Jacob answered Shechem and his father Hamor deceitfully, because he had defiled their sister Dinah. They said to them, "We cannot do this thing, to give our sister to one who is uncircumcised, for that would be a disgrace to us. Only on this condition will we agree with you, that you will become as we are, by every male among you being circumcised. Then we will give our daughters to you, and we will take your daughters to ourselves, and we will dwell with you and become one people. But if you will not listen to us and be circumcised, then we will take our daughters and we will be gone." Their words pleased Hamor and Hamor's son Shechem, and the young man did not delay to do the thing, because he delighted in Jacob's daughter. Now he was the most honored of all his father's house. So Hamor and his son Shechem came to the gate of their city and spoke to the men of their city, saying, "These men are at peace with us. Let them dwell in the land and trade in it, for behold, the land is large enough for them. Let us take their daughters as wives, and let us give them our daughters. Only on this condition will the men agree to dwell with us, to become one people, when every male among us is circumcised, as they are circumcised. Will not their livestock, their property, and all the beasts be ours? Only let us agree with them, and they will dwell with us." And all who went out of the gate of his city listened to Hamor and his son Shechem, and every male was circumcised, all who went out of the gate of his city. On the third day, when they were sore, two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and came against the city, while it felt secure, and killed all of the males. They killed Hamor and his son Shechem with the swords, and took Dinah out of Shechem's house and went away. The sons of Jacob came upon and slain and plundered the city, because they had defiled their sister. They took their flocks and their herds, their donkeys, and whatever was in the city and in the fields, all their wealth, all their little ones, and their wives, all that was in the houses they captured and plundered. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You have brought trouble on me by making me stink to the inhabitants of this land, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. My numbers are few, and if they gather themselves against me and attack me, I shall be destroyed, both I and my household. But they say, should he treat our sister like a prostitute?" Now, I know it's kind of a lot to take in that chapter. So they arrive in the land and start to dwell in it. And Shechem, who is the prince of the land, Hamor is the king, Shechem takes Dinah and violates her. And Jacob knew about this, so we see here that he found out, but he kept quiet. He figured he'd keep his peace. And I think that's something that a lot of us here with conflict avoidance tell ourselves is, oh, we're keeping the peace. I'm not going to create more of a problem, even though there's a problem. The problem with that is that it leaves the door open. If we don't do anything, it leaves the door open for more damage to happen. You know, what happened to Dinah was evil. That is the evil in this. But what happens next, because of the lack of action, just creates more evil. You know, Shechem decided he wanted to marry Dinah after violating her. It didn't matter what Dinah thought. It didn't matter what anyone else thought. He wanted to marry her because he felt close. And who did he talk to? Levi and Simeon, not Jacob, which kind of weird in their culture, right? You would not talk to the brothers. You would talk to the dad about marrying a daughter. And because Jacob was being passive, it left that door open for Levi and Simeon to get revenge on their sister. So the king and his people all agreed, we'll get circumcised so that Shechem could have Dinah as his wife. And after they all got circumcised, they were sore on the third day. And on the third day, when they were vulnerable, Simeon and Levi went in and killed everybody, killed all the men, plundered, stole all their stuff, took their wives, took their children, took their livestock, took everything. And it wasn't until after that Jacob finally, we see he says something in this, and what does he say? He says, "You have brought me trouble. My numbers are few, and they are going to gather and attack me." All Jacob cared about after all this happened was what was going to happen to him, not what happened to Dinah, not how his sons reacted, not that the people that he bought land from were all just murdered by his family. All he said was how they've wronged him. I'm sure none of us can relate to being a little inward thinking sometimes. I'm guilty of it. That was most of the patterns when I was a teenager. I was really only thinking about how I would look when I had to confront these issues. I figured my actions were only hurting myself, so what's the big deal? I think in general, it's really easy for us to get caught up in ourselves when we don't see how our actions are harming people around us. But what if we keep thinking that way? What if we keep telling ourselves that it's only me when it's not? I didn't have kids when I was making these choices as a teenager, and I still don't have kids, but we have a lot of kids sitting here. We have a lot of kids in the other room. And Jacob had kids, and they were picking up on these deceitful traits that Jacob had, that they've seen him his whole life. And they picked up those same habits. And, I don't think anyone in here is a bad parent. But how are we acting outside of Sundays? How are we as aware as we could be of the things that we're passing down to our kids, how we're treating our spouses, how we talk to our friends when our kids may be just in the other room and can hear us? How do they see us handle conflict? For those of us who don't have kids, it's still important because somebody is always watching you. I'm up here right now. These kids are watching me. You guys are watching me. What I say matters. And as Christians, how are we reflected to other Christians or people especially who are not Christian? I don't think as parents, we don't want to stand in the way of your kids becoming better than you. And as Christians, we don't want to stand in the way of somebody else finding their way towards God in their own journey. And there's kind of a lot to take in from this chapter. And honestly, kind of while I was studying it, I was like, oh, this and this. And I could do a whole 30, 40-minute message just on this chapter. Because I think it's important with chapters like this that kind of have really uncomfortable topics, that we understand how to process them and how the Bible makes us feel uncomfortable sometimes and how we have to kind of let it in a way. It's important to understand it, but there's reasons that these passages make us uncomfortable. The first time I read this, I was on Simeon and Levi's side. Just kind of a quick glance, I read it, and I was like, you know what? I feel like I would want something equally as awful to happen if someone violated my sister. That's one of the most vile crimes that I can think of. So my mind first time is like, yeah, no, totally get it. And I'm not, like I said, I avoid conflict like the plague, but I don't even know what I would have done if I was put into their situation. I hope I wouldn't react like Jacob and just do nothing. But as you read and kind of as you learn more, you start to understand maybe Levi and Simeon took it a little too far. That the punishment severely outweighed the crime. And this chapter is kind of a good example of people left to their own devices without God. We don't really see once in this chapter where God's mentioned. Not that he's absent or that he's not involved in any way, but nobody's turning to him. We've been talking about this idea of a flood pattern or a flood narrative throughout Genesis, which is not always a flood, but it's a pattern. Evil escalates, the innocent get harmed, there's an outcry, God intervenes with judgment, and then God renews through covenant. We saw it with Cain and Abel. Violence entered the world, and generations later, that violence just multiplies until God intervenes. And then the flood. And then God makes that new covenant with Noah because there was an outcry. We even see it with Hagar, who we talked about just a few weeks ago. She was exploited and oppressed by the people with power over her, and she cried out to God. And God saw her and intervened and makes promises for her future. But Genesis 34 is kind of like a nightmare version of this flood narrative. It follows the same pattern, but there's no outcry. Dinah's violated. Evil happens, but nobody turns to God. Jacob is silent. The brothers, Simeon and Levi, they don't pray. They don't ask God for any kind of guidance. No one seeks out God. Instead, Simeon and Levi take judgment into their own hands. And when humans take God's place as judge, usually that judgment is going to turn to violence. Genesis 34 shows us what happens when evil occurs and no one turns to God, not because he is absent or indifferent, but because people choose to act on their own. And this chapter is kind of intentionally unresolved. We don't get a happy ending. We don't really get much in this. There's no altar. There's no covenant. There's no renewal. And it's kind of meant to leave us unsettled. Because reconciliation happened in chapter 33, but the renewal that God promised hasn't come yet. And just because it's coming doesn't mean that everything on the way is going to be great. So chapter 35 kind of shifts gears a little bit. And it says, God said to Jacob, "Arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there. Make an altar there to the God who appeared to you, and you fled from your brother Esau." So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, "Put away the foreign gods that are among you, and purify yourselves, and change your garments. Then let us arise and go up to Bethel, so that I may make there an altar to God, who answers me in the day of my distress, and has been with me wherever I have gone." So they gave to Jacob all their foreign gods that they had, and the rings that were in their ears. Jacob hid them under the terebinth tree that was near Shechem. And as they journeyed, a terror from God fell upon the cities that were around them, so that they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. So we saw Jacob was kind of afraid everyone was going to get together and attack them. We don't know if a terror from God means that God physically did something to these people, or if it was just they were afraid because they knew Jacob was protected by God. We're not really sure. But the point being that God is keeping his promise. He is continuing to protect Jacob. And Jacob came to Luz, which is Bethel, which is in the land of Canaan. He and all the people who were with him, and there he built an altar and called the place El Bethel, because there God had revealed himself to him when he fled from his brother. And Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried under an oak below Bethel, so he called its name Elon Bakuth. So this is where we start seeing the renewal finally come, after the reconciliation. Jacob finally returns to Bethel after all this time and all these other missteps that he takes. He's finally there, and God commands them to build an altar and get rid of all their false idols. They're cleansing themselves. They're changing their garments. These are all depictions of them cleansing themselves. And it's an example for us to get rid of the things that are not keeping us close to God. God is there, right? And he's always there. He kept his promise to Jacob just like he's going to keep his promise to us. And our part is just to trust him. And then God appeared to Jacob when he had came from Padan Aram and blessed him. And God said to him, "Your name is Jacob. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name." So he called his name Israel. And if we read chapter 32, he told him that after the wrestling match. He made the promise, and then this is the confirmation of that promise. This is that renewal, him changing his name to Israel. And he makes kind of a new covenant with him, but it's really an extension on the old covenant that he made with Abraham and Isaac, just that the line that he promised was now going to go through Jacob and his offspring. And the rest of the chapter kind of goes on a little bit about the birth of Benjamin and Rachel passing away, some genealogy stuff that's always fun for the sake of time. I didn't really want to go into all of that. I do encourage you, if you feel like you're missing anything, go ahead and read it, but I didn't want to take away from the takeaway of these chapters. But that being, Jacob's return to Bethel is the recreation moment and the pattern of themes that we see in Genesis. He and his family are getting rid of all of their old baggage and items from where they came from and are embracing their new identities, now defined by God, not defined by what they had. Which is the calling for all of us as Christians, right? What Jacob was doing physically, getting rid of these things, we're called to do it spiritually. Renewal is about living differently, not just believing differently. Jacob believed differently for a little bit. He trusted God, but he still screwed up a ton. We're called to live differently, and we see it all throughout the Bible. Ephesians, put off your old self, which belongs to your former manner of life, and put on a new self created after the likeness of God. Romans 6:4. We are buried therefore with him by baptism into death, in order that we too might walk in newness of life. 2 Corinthians. If anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away, behold, the new has come. Burning our idols and living differently is how we grow closer to God. Without doing that, we'll probably just revert back to our own sinful patterns that we probably turned to God in the first place to get out of. I know this is kind of a weird roller coaster of 3 chapters, but it's important because we get to understand and see what reconciliation and renewal looks like through God and what it can look like without God. Jacob reuniting with Esau in chapter 33 shows us what reconciliation can look like. Chapter 34 shows us that dangerous patterns like passivity or leaning on our own sense of judgment instead of God's is only going to make things worse if they keep going unchecked. Chapter 35 shows us what renewal really looks like when we bury our idols and return back to faith and trust in God, not just reconciling. When I was talking at the beginning about my family issues, I mentioned that forgiveness or reconciliation doesn't always mean happily ever after. Sometimes it just means moving on. I feel like I've reconciled with my family members for the most part, and that was mainly through time and avoidance. But that's not going to fix everything without renewal. And renewal also doesn't mean happily ever after, in case you're wondering. Bad stuff is still going to happen. Unfortunately, we ended up losing my mom eventually. Even though we've reconciled, bad stuff still happened. And we're going to break relationships due to conflict avoidance. Or if you're the opposite, and like Levi and Simeon, where maybe you're too eager to find conflict. Relationships are going to break. Either way, without renewal, we're likely to just fall back into the same patterns that caused the issues in the first place. And next time, it's probably going to end up a whole lot worse. Renewal is only something that can happen through God. We have reconciliation. That's a gift. But renewal is what happens when we stop avoiding, we bury the things that don't bring us closer to God, and return to where God first met us. And that's kind of my challenge to everybody moving forward this week is you bury something that you feel like you've needed to for a while now. Renewal, just one thing. Renewal doesn't mean fix everything right away. Bury one thing. And maybe you don't feel like you have any idols to bury. That's fine. Maybe reflect on some difficult conversations that you've been avoiding and try to have one of those. And that doesn't mean start an argument with your wife because the guy at church told you to. have a real, truthful conversation with somebody. And if both of those sound scary, because they are, I get it, then I just challenge you to return to where God first met you. Whether that was through scripture or prayer or worship, go back to that place and just meet with God in that way. And be intentional with it. Don't just fit it in. Schedule time for it. Really sit down and visit with God. Bethel isn't just a location like it was for Jacob, it's a posture. It's the place where we stop avoiding and running and we meet God again. I'm going to pray and then we'll jump into table talks and go into this a little more. God, thank you for meeting us where we are, even when we've been avoiding things we need to face. Help us this week, God, and just help us let go of what doesn't belong. Help us with the conversations that we've been avoiding and putting off, and help us just come back to you again. Make us a church that chooses honesty, truth, and reconciliation over trust in ourselves and avoidance. We're here, God, because you are faithful. And it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thanks.